Time skip. The birth of their little bean, the sterile smell of the hospital room filled the air as Widen cried out, her hands gripping Taehyung's with all the strength she had left. Her face was flushed, beads of sweat rolling down her forehead as the pain tore through her. The doctor's voice was firm yet calm, instructing her, one more big push, Widen, you're almost there. Taehyung, seated by her side, his eyes bloodshot and filled with worrying, leaned closer, whispering, you're doing so well, love. Just a little more. I'm here, always here. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the strong front he was trying to maintain. Seeing the woman he adored in such pain was breaking him, but he knew he had to be her pillar right now. Widen sobbed, Tae, I can't do this anymore. You can, baby, he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers gently. You're the strongest person I know. Our Lil Bean is waiting for you. Just one more push. I believe in you. Her cries filled the room as she gave one final, agonizing push. The moment felt like an eternity before the air was suddenly pierced by the loud, healthy wail of a newborn. Taehyung's breath hitched as his head dropped onto Widen's shoulder, tears finally spilling from his eyes. The doctor announced joyfully, it's a boy. Taehyung lifted his head, his eyes glistening with inch tears as he looked at Widen. You did it, my love, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You won. Our reward is here. Widen sobbed softly, her exhaustion overtaken by relief and joy. She looked up at Taehyung, her lips trembling as she smiled faintly. He's here, Tae. He's here. The nurse brought their baby over, swaddled tightly in a blanket, and placed him gently in Widen's arms. The baby's cries softened as he felt the warmth of his mother. Widen looked down at their son, her tears flowing freely now. He's perfect, she whispered, her voice shaking. Taehyung's large hand reached out to touch the baby's tiny fingers, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and overwhelming love. He's so small, so precious, he murmured, his voice barely audible. He leaned down, kissing Widen's temple. Thank you, Widen, for giving me everything. For giving me him. Widen looked up at him, her tired eyes filled with love. We did this together, Tae. He's ours. The baby let out a small whimper, and Taehyung chuckled softly, wiping his tears away. Already making his presence known, huh? That's my boy. As they sat there, the three of them together for the first time, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just them, Taehyung, Widen, and their Lil Bean. The beginning of a new chapter, filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. The baby let out a small whimper, and Taehyung chuckled softly, wiping his tears away. Already making his presence known, huh? That's my boy. As they sat there, the three of them together for the first time, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just them, Taehyung, Widen, and their Lil Bean. The beginning of a new chapter, filled with love, hope, and endless possibilities. Taehyung carefully carried their Lil Bean inside the house, his face glowing with pride. Mrs. Kim rushed to them, her arms outstretched. My precious grandbaby, she exclaimed, her eyes welling with tears. Shh, Mom. He just fell asleep, Taehyung said in a playful whisper, cradling the baby like a rare artifact. Widen smiled, tired but happy. Mrs. Kim gestured them to the sofa. Widen, sit down, sweetheart. I'll hold him. Widen hesitated. Are you sure? He's so tiny, Mrs. Kim shot her a mock glare. I raised a son, didn't I? Give me my grandson. Taehyung laughed as he handed the baby to his mother. Don't drop him, Mom, he teased, earning a swat on his arm. You. Go make tea, Mrs. Kim replied, her attention already on the baby. Look at this angel. He's going to grow up and be just as handsome as his dad. Widen chuckled, leaning against Taehyung, who had plopped down next to her. And hopefully just as mischievous, Widen teased. Excuse me, Taehyung protested, feigning offense. I am the epitome of responsibility. Mrs. Kim laughed. Sure, son, whoever helps you sleep at night. At 2 months old, their Lil Bean gave his first smile. Wyan was holding him during tummy time, encouraging him to lift his head. "Come on, sweetie, you can do it," she cooed. Taehyung crouched beside them with his phone, recording every second. "He's going to be a bodybuilder at this rate," Taehyung joked. The baby suddenly lifted his tiny head, making a gurgling noise before breaking into a toothless smile. Wyan gasped, "Taehyung, did you see that?" He smiled. "Read more greater than I did." Taehyung's voice was full of awe. He leaned down, grinning. "That's my boy." Already charming the ladies. "Hey, stop it," Wyan said, laughing. She playfully shoved his arm, her face glowing with joy. Mrs. Kim became the ultimate grandmother, spoiling her grandson with love and gifts. One morning, Wyan entered the living room to find Mrs. Kim lying on the carpet, pretending to be a horse while her grandson giggled on her back. "Mom," Wyan exclaimed, trying not to laugh. "What?" Mrs. Kim said, breathless but beaming. "Anything for my little angel, right, baby?" The baby babbled happily, waving his tiny arms. Wyan shook her head. "You're going to spoil him rotten." One afternoon, Wyan was cooking in the kitchen when Taehyung walked in, carrying the baby. He placed the baby in the bassinet and leaned casually against the counter. "You look extra cute today," he said, his voice low and teasing. Wyan rolled her eyes, stirring the pot. "You always say that." "Because it's true," he countered, stepping closer. "Are you blushing?" "I'm not," Wyan protested, though her cheeks betrayed her. Taehyung grinned, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You know, if the Lil Bean weren't here, I'd read more greater than Taehyung," Wyan exclaimed, shoving him away playfully. "Behave," the baby giggled, as if understanding the interaction. Taehyung smirked. "See, even he agrees his dad's a charmer." By 6 months, their Lil Bean had started sitting up and babbling nonstop. One evening, the three of them were sprawled on the floor with toys scattered around. "Say appa," Taehyung urged, holding a soft toy above the baby. Wyan countered, shaking a rattle. The baby blinked at them both, then let out a squeal. "Did you hear that?" Taehyung said, grinning. He sang appa. Wyan raised an eyebrow. "Pretty sure that was Mrs. Kim entered the room with a plate of snacks. "Let's settle this, shall we?" "Say Granny, my love." Wyan and Taehyung groaned in unison as Mrs. Kim left, scooping up her grandson. Later that night, as Wyan and Taehyung lay in bed, Wyan smiled softly. "Our Lil Bean is growing up so fast." Each day with their Lil Bean brought new adventures, laughter, and love. Their family grew stronger with every smile, every milestone, and every shared moment, leaving behind a legacy of happiness and unity. The room was dim, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun peeking through the curtains. The scent of alcohol lingered in the air, mingling with the remnants of smoke from a cigarette that had been long discarded. Jungkook lay on the floor, his head resting on the edge of the bed, staring up at the ceiling with a look of distant longing. His eyes were glazed, his mind lost in the haze of memories. Empty liquor bottles were scattered around him, each one a reminder of the nights he had spent drowning in the pain of missing her. Yet, despite the clouded state of his mind, a small, painful smile tugged at his lips as he thought about the woman he couldn't stop loving. "Wyan," he whispered softly, his voice thick with a mix of nostalgia and regret. The memories flooded back in waves, each one more vivid than the last. He could hear her laughter, bright and carefree, echoing in his mind. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon. Jungkook had decided to surprise Wai and buy cooking for her, something he'd never really done before. He'd spent hours in the kitchen, experimenting with various dishes, trying his best to make something that would impress her. Wai stood by the counter, watching him with an amused expression as he focused intensely on the stove. "Are you sure you know what you're doing, Jungkook?" Wyan teased, her eyes sparkling with playful mischief. Jungkook shot her a quick glance, a smirk curling on his lips. "I'm not just a pretty face, you know. I can cook too. Wyden raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, you've burned toast before. He chuckled, shaking his head. That was one time, and it was an accident. Sure, she replied, her tone light but filled with affection. After a moment, Jungkook placed the finished dish in front of her, a beautifully plated bowl of noodles with a side of crispy chicken. Wyden's eyes widened in surprise. Wow, this actually looks good, she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. Jungkook leaned against the counter, watching her eagerly as she took a bite. So Wyden took her time, savoring the flavors. After a few moments, she looked up at him with a grin. You really outdid yourself. I'm impressed. Jungkook's chest swelled with pride at her words. You think so? I'm glad you like it. Flashback. Street food date. It was a cool evening, and Wyden and Jungkook had decided to grab some street food. The streets were alive with the hustle and bustle of people, but in their little world, it felt as if time had slowed down. They sat on a bench, sharing skewers of grilled meat and crispy tteokbokki. Wyden took a bite of the tteokbokki and laughed, wiping her mouth. I can't believe you're getting me hooked on this stuff. I swear, you're a bad influence. Jungkook grinned, playfully nudging her with his elbow. I'm just introducing you to the good stuff. You can thank me later. Wyden rolled her eyes, but the smile on her face told a different story. I can't believe I'm actually eating this with you. I'm starting to think I'm never going to get rid of you. Jungkook chuckled, his eyes softening as he looked at her. You never have to get rid of me. I'll be right here, as long as you'll have me. It was late, and the city below them buzzed with life. Wyden and Jungkook lay on the rooftop, side by side, the cool breeze rustling their hair. Wyden gazed up at the stars, her mind lost in thought. Do you ever wonder what's out there? She asked, her voice quiet, almost as if she were speaking to the universe itself. Jungkook shifted to his side, propping his head up with his hand. He watched her as she stared at the sky, her eyes wide with wonder. He couldn't help but smile at how innocent and pure she looked in that moment. She was everything to him. He reached out, gently lifting her chin with his finger, turning her face toward him. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the world around them ceased to exist. Wyden, he whispered, his voice low and full of affection. You're my moon. You light up my world even when everything feels dark. Wyden's breath caught in her throat at his words. She didn't know how to respond, but she didn't need to. She simply smiled softly, her heart full as she looked into his eyes. I feel the same way about you, she said quietly. Jungkook leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead. I love you, Wyden, always. Flashback ends, back in the present. The memory of that moment still lingered in the air like a warm embrace. Jungkook closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek as he let out a shaky breath. I miss you, he whispered to the empty room. But even in his pain, there was a sense of peace. Because no matter what, he would always carry those moments with him, and for now, that was enough. The Lee household had always been a place of love, warmth, and quiet stability. But today, it was a shell of its former self. The house felt suffocating, filled with an air of despair and tension. Yuna had lost herself, consumed by thoughts that only spiraled deeper into madness. She had locked herself in her room, refusing to leave for days, her mind a chaotic storm of delusions. Yeri stood in the hallway, her face pale, eyes red from hours of weeping. Her hand was tightly gripping the doorframe, her body trembling. Beside her, Mr. Lee leaned against the wall, his face a mask of heartbreak, unable to even muster the strength to speak. They had tried everything, medication, therapy, and even pleading with her, nothing worked. Yuna was beyond reason. Inside the room, Yuna was sitting on the bed, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her once beautiful face was now gaunt, eyes wide and hollow with obsession. Her fingers twitched erratically, like she was trying to hold onto some semblance of sanity, but it was slipping away. She mumbled to herself, her voice shaking with desperation. I'm pregnant. I'm carrying his child. He can't leave me. He can't. Her breath hitched as she repeated the words over and over like a mantra. Jungkook, please come back to me. Please, I'm the one for you, not her. Not why when. It's me. It's always been me. Every time she spoke his name, her mind fractured more. It wasn't just her obsession with Jungkook that consumed her. It was the idea of him, of what could have been if only why and hadn't existed. She could feel her sanity unraveling. Call him, Dad, she cried out suddenly, her voice high-pitched, almost frantic. You need to call him. Tell him I'm here. Tell him I'm waiting. I won't leave her. I swear. I'll kill her if I have to. But he belongs with me. Her eyes were wild, filled with manic energy as her hands clawed at her face. Yeri's breath caught in her throat. Yuna, please, she choked on the words, trying to hold back the tears. This isn't you. You're not thinking straight. Please, come back to us. You have to snap out of it. Mr. Lee stood there, frozen, his face ashen. His daughter, the girl he had raised with love and care, was slipping through his fingers. She was no longer the bright, lively Yuna he once knew. She was a shell, consumed by a love that had turned to madness. I failed her, Mr. Lee murmured, his voice barely audible. I failed her. I don't know what to do anymore. Yeri broke down, clutching at her father's arm as her sobs echoed through the quiet house. She's gone. Dad. She's gone. From the other room, the sound of footsteps approached. Mrs. Lee, frail and weakened by years of chronic heart disease, entered slowly, her face pale, her steps slow and shaky. She had heard the commotion. She could feel the weight of the family's grief pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked at her husband and daughter, the pain evident in her eyes. This is karma, she said quietly, her voice tinged with bitterness. The universe doesn't keep debts. It pays them back. All these years, we thought we could control everything. But now it's come back to us. Yuri's head snapped up, her terrors still fresh. What do you mean, Mom? Mrs. Lee's eyes filled with sorrow. Our wrongdoings, they've come full circle. Yuna was always too sheltered, too protected, and we failed her in so many ways. We tried to control her life, to push her into things she didn't want. And look what happened. She paused, her breath shallow. I used to blame myself for being sick. But now I realize this this is the price we've had to pay. Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The guilt that had lingered in the family for years now seemed to have manifested in Yuna's breakdown. Mrs. Lee's heartache mirrored the pain of a mother who knew that nothing could save her child from the consequences of her own actions. Mr. Lee's face crumpled with grief, his shoulders shaking as he let out a sob. I never wanted this for her. We just wanted the best for her. We thought if we kept her away from the world, away from her mistakes, we could protect her. He clutched his chest, his voice cracking. But we failed her. We failed her, Yeri. Yeri, her face streaked with tears, stepped forward, her voice raw with emotion. No. We didn't fail her. Dad, we tried. We all tried. But sometimes people make choices. Bad choices. And they can't take them back. She knelt down beside her mother, holding her hand tightly, trying to calm her trembling form. We're all broken right now, but we have to stick together. Yuna. She's not beyond help. She's not beyond saving. Mrs. Lee shook her head slowly, tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. I wish I could believe that. Inside the room, Yuna's cries grew louder. Please, Dad. Please, tell him to come back. I need him. I'll do anything. I'll kill Y, and if I have to. She took him away from me. Mr. Lee collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed with sorrow. She's gone mad, he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. The universe's debt the family had become prisoners of their own choices, and the universe, with its brutal sense of justice, had delivered the consequences. The heartbreak and guilt weighed heavily on them all, a reminder that no matter how hard one tried to escape the past, it would always find a way to catch up. The warm light of the late afternoon streamed through the windows, casting a golden hue over the cozy living room. Mrs. Kim was sitting on the floor, her face bright with a soft smile as she played with her grandson, Taehyung. He was a bundle of energy, laughing and running around with his small, wobbly steps, his little giggles echoing through the room. Taehyung had just come back from a long day at work. He was tired, the weight of the day evident on his face, but the moment he stepped inside, his gaze softened when he saw his son's joyful little face. He couldn't help but smile. Taehyung turned, his eyes lighting up as he spotted his father. "Dada!" he shouted, his voice full of excitement. Tae knelt down, arms wide open. "Yes," he called out, grinning as his son ran into his embrace. He picked Taehyung up, spinning him around before bringing him close for a hug. "How was work, Dada?" Taehyung asked innocently, his tiny hands clutching Tae's shirt. Tae chuckled. "Work was tiring, but seeing you makes it all worth it." He kissed his son's cheek, making Taehyung giggle. Mrs. Kim watched with a warm smile, her heart swelling at the sight of her son and grandson. "Such a happy boy you have, Tae." "Yeah," Tae replied, his voice soft with affection. "He's full of energy, just like his mother." Taehyung wriggled in Tae's arms, making Tae laugh. "Dada, tickle," he exclaimed, pointing to his father's sides. Tae grinned, his eyes sparkling as he gently tickled Taehyung, causing him to burst out in uncontrollable laughter. The sound of his giggles filled the room, making both Tae and Mrs. Kim laugh along. But suddenly, everything changed. A loud, piercing scream echoed from upstairs. "YN scream!" Mrs. Kim watched him go, her heart heavy with worrying as she struggled to climb the stairs behind him. She knew her knees weren't as strong as they used to be, but she couldn't help but feel the urgency in her son's actions. Tae burst into the room, finding YN sitting on the floor, tears streaming down her face. His heart clenched as he took in the sight. "YN now?" He rushed to her, kneeling in front of her with his hands gently cupping her face, wiping away her tears. "What happened? Did you fall?" YN shook her head, her lips trembling as she tried to speak through her sobs. She held something tightly in her hand, her fingers gripping it like a lifeline. Tae's eyes flickered to what she was holding, and his breath caught in his throat. "YN," he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at what she had shown him. It was a pregnancy test, a second one, positive. Tae's lips parted in shock. "Why you?" he stammered, his eyes searching her face for confirmation. In nodded, her tear-filled eyes locking with his. "We ... are pregnant again, Tae," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tae's heart swelled with emotion, and without thinking, he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her like he never wanted to let go. His eyes welled up with tears as he whispered, "We're having another baby." YN hugged him back, burying her face in his chest, her tears mingling with his. "I'm so scared, Tae," she whispered. "What if I can't do it again? What if ... what if we're not ready?" Tae pulled back slightly to look at her, his hands gently lifting her chin. His gaze was filled with unwavering love and confidence. "YN, we are ready. We've been through so much, and now we have each other. We can do this. We're going to be okay." They shared a tender kiss, the weight of their shared love and new beginnings settling between them. In that moment, all the fears, doubts, and worries melted away, leaving only a sense of peace. Tae and YN made their way downstairs, holding hands as they entered the living room. Mrs. Kim, still holding Taehyung in her lap, looked up at them with a curious expression, her eyes softening when she saw the joyful, yet teary look on their faces. Tae sat next to her, taking a deep breath before he spoke. "Mom ... We have some news," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Mrs. Kim raised an eyebrow, her face lighting up as she sensed the excitement. "What is it, Tae?" Tae turned to YN, his heart swelling with happiness as he looked at her. In gave him a soft, nervous smile before she spoke. "We're having another baby," Hwan said, her voice trembling but full of joy. Mrs. Kim gasped, her eyes wide with surprise and delight. "Oh my goodness, that's wonderful news." She stood up with a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm so happy for you both." She looked at Taehyung, who was now sitting on the floor, playing with his toys. Taehyung will have a little sibling. Taehyung looked up at his grandmother and grinned. "I want a sister," he announced, his little voice full of innocence and excitement. Mrs. Kim laughed, her eyes glistening with happiness. "We all do, sweetheart. We all do." She placed a hand on Hwan's shoulder, her expression full of love and warmth. "You've made me the happiest grandmother in the world." The family gathered together, the joy and love that filled the room stronger than ever. The future seemed brighter, filled with new beginnings and the promise of another little one to bring laughter and love into their home. They had been through their share of struggles, but now, together, they were stronger than ever. With a growing family, a supportive and loving bond, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it hand in hand. The universe had indeed balanced its debts, but this was a new chapter, one of love, hope, and endless possibilities.